Welcome to Going Underground with me, Afshin Rattansi. Every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday, we're bringing you the stories that really matter in the United Kingdom as we break through the mainstream headlines. In today's show, Muslims are a convenient common enemy, but how much further will Britain go to create an enemy that could be a useful tool for justifying global war? Plus, it turns out the Palestinians are to blame for the illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, or so the press would like us to believe. And the British economy is also apparently growing. One former member of the Monetary Policy Committee tells us that means it's time to raise interest rates. For these stories and more, let's go underground. But first, a legal clause has been passed in Parliament that may have devastating consequences for all of us. Thanks to the Liberal Democrats, NHS hospitals, even those which are performing well, can be shut down to pay for the losses made by the financial services industry. Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt looks set to have sweeping powers to close hospitals after coalition MPs voted by 297 to 239 to back the transformation in the way healthcare is provided in Britain. Deputy Labour leader Harriet Harman was last week scathing about the leader of the Liberal Democrats the morning after the vote.
The truth is that the Health Secretary broke the law which gave local people a say, so decided to change the law. And the Lib Dems could have stepped in and stopped it. But oh no, here's what they did instead. First they said they were against the change, then they put down an amendment, then they sold out to the Tories, and the Tories got their way again. Is there any logic to how the Lib Dems vote other than self-interest?
Did you notice Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt smiling when Harman said he broke the law? It cost taxpayers more than £100,000 to unsuccessfully use the courts to thwart local people fighting to keep an A&E ward running in Lewisham Hospital in southeast London. Certainly no signs that the government thinks all those legal fees could have been better spent on public health provision. Who knows which hospital is now safe from Jeremy Hunt's axe? Following the arrest in Britain of 4 people suspected of connections to terrorism in Syria, Cressida Dick, the most senior counter-terrorism officer in the country, welcomed the rise of Syria-related arrests in the UK. But the death of Lee Rigby and the justification offered by his killers raised questions about foreign policy-related terrorism in Britain. And faced with the prospect of domestic terrorism, London Mayor Boris Johnson suggested this month that Muslim children at risk of being radicalised should be removed from their families and taken into care. So who is really to blame for extremism on our own soil? With me is Arun Kundani. He's adjunct professor at New York University. He's just written The Muslims Are Coming. Arun, welcome. Our mayor makes announcements about the fact that Muslim children should be taken into care for fear of radicalisation. What was your first response to that?
Well, the first thing is the kind of factual premise behind it is totally false. So the idea that the children of extremists are likely to become extremists themselves just doesn't stand up. If you look at all of the cases of actual terrorists, they've become terrorists in spite of their parents' influence, not because of it. But beyond that, I mean, I think the idea of splitting up families, taking children from their parents, putting them into some kind of state institution, because of the ideas that the parents have, because of the ideology the parents have, is shocking, and it goes against basic principles of how you're meant to protect the interests of children. And yet, more people weren't shocked. Obviously, someone like Boris Johnson over here in London is a populist politician, so he obviously thinks he's hitting some kind of chord. He's previously said young Muslims infected by the Islamist virus. Presumably people like that, otherwise he wouldn't be saying things like that. Well, these kind of statements have become banal now, right? They're just not seen as shocking at all. And the reason for that is because we've had probably about 20 years now of so-called terrorism experts and officials and pundits and commentators telling us a kind of theory of why terrorism happens that is basically false, but has been circulated time and time again. And it's exactly this idea that Boris Johnson invokes when he talks about this idea of a virus of extremism circulating amongst young people. The idea is that some set of bad ideas is the root cause of terrorism. But all the evidence suggests that isn't the case, and that actually terrorism, the kind of ultimate root cause of terrorism, is political. It's to do with, ultimately the foreign policies of our own government.
And of course, when people do raise that, they say, "Oh, you're just excusing the terrorists." Your book very clearly traces the new generation of Islamification. I don't know what the right word is. Just tell me a little bit about that. That it's not that radicalization and terrorism are not the same.
Right, so we've in the last kind of 10 years, we've had this concept of radicalization emerge, right, particularly from the kind of security officials, the world of counterterrorism. And the idea of radicalization is that you can be turned from being an ordinary Muslim in a Western society into a terrorist just by coming across certain ideas and an ideology, right? And the reality is that if you look at things that way, you're just ignoring the kind of wider picture of the political contexts that generate political violence and terrorism.
And I know you look at Oldham, perhaps in particular in the book, and talk about that generational difference of why children are getting, another generation's getting into Islam, as it were.
Right. I mean, if you look at the history of some of these communities, we have communities that have migrated historically from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, for example. And if you go back to the early 1980s, the way that people looked for solutions to the kinds of political injustices they were experiencing in their lives, whether it was kind of racist violence on the street or institutional racism in policing or kind of issues to do with immigration policy, people at that time turned to a kind of secular radical leftism, right? That maybe had come from the Black Panther Party in the United States or been inspired by the kind of anti-colonial movements in the Indian subcontinent. And at that time, in the context of the Cold War, the fear was that this kind of left-wing radicalization was infecting young Asians in Britain, right? And the government at that time actually preferred the kind of conservative Islam that it actually sponsored as a kind of rival set of community voices.
So you're talking, so there's racism, neo-colonialism, as it were, and these are the factors that
right. I mean, I think if you want to understand, if you look at the biographies of the 7/7 bombers, right, from 2005, if you want to understand how they ended up feeling that it was legitimate for them to commit this act of mass murder on their fellow civilians, you have to, you can talk about their religious ideology, and that's a part of the picture, but you have to also look at the wider political context, the racism in the society they've grown up in, and the Iraq War is a huge factor here, right? So if you look at the terrorism statistics from 2003, when the Iraq War starts, to 2006, the number of terrorist convictions more than doubles in Britain. Then by 2009, it goes down again to what it was before, right? The only way to make sense of that is to think about that context of foreign policy. We have millions of people come out onto the streets in 2003 to protest against the impending Iraq War, calling for Britain not to be involved in it. A lot of people optimistic. They think that in a democratic society, that number of people on the streets is bound to pressure the government to withdraw from this. It doesn't happen. In that context of a kind of political failure in our society and a political defeat, actually, it's exactly the kind of context that historically, time and time again, we see giving rise to terrorism.
And it's those precise liberals that were on that demonstration that are horrified by 7/7, well, we're all horrified by 7/7 and so on, that have also started to say, look, this dangerous radicalization in these communities, it must be stopped. The mosques preaching hate.
Right. I think it's been much more comfortable.
But that is the case.
I think it's been much more comfortable for a lot of liberals to think that this is all the result of some kind of crazy alien religious ideology, than actually to face up to, the role that that actually our politics and this society's politics has caused. Right, it's easier to blame religion than politics here, and that's I think been a large part of why liberals have focused in on this concept of radicalisation.
And you make the case, as if it need to be made, but it probably does, that Islam and the state, those relations, because that's the thing you'll see in The Guardian or the independent newspapers, the left-leaning, certainly the Labour Party people, that there is kind of something problematic about Islam as a religion.
Right.
It doesn't understand state and jurisprudence.
Yeah, so this is I mean, the kind of, the standard narrative that you get from liberals is that, and conservatives, is that Islam, by its very nature, is a religion that will not constrain itself to the private sphere, but it always wants to take over the political sphere, take over the state. It doesn't have, the kind of church-state separation that Western liberalism is supposed to value, right? The reality is that there's always been going back more than 1,000 years, there's been de facto separation of religion and politics in Islam. Right?
Just 1,000 years, then.
Just 1,000 years, yeah. But more importantly, how people, you can't understand religion by thinking about some kind of core essence to it that kind of always plays out time and time again. So this is the mistake that liberals tend to make, is they think, okay, here's Islam and it's always the same, and it just kind of corrupts people into behaving in certain ways. Whereas how Islam gives you a broad moral framework, but how you actually apply it depends on the context you're in, right? And in a political context of, think about the Middle East in the 20th century, the political context of all kinds of injustices taking place. People obviously try and mobilize their religious belief system in order to try and make sense of that, right? And so it's for me, the religion isn't really the ultimate cause here. What's the ultimate cause is the political context.
And the standard argument is that if you start to talk about foreign policy, you're excusing the people that beheaded Lee Rigby.
Right. If we want to create a society where we don't have a problem with terrorism, we need to understand what causes it, right? And we can't do that if, as soon as we ask questions about causation, we get into this thing of any possible attempt to explain causation inevitably implies excusing it, right? That's just not going to get us anywhere. And obviously, individually, anyone who uses violence against civilians has to be, absolutely condemned, right? But if we're going to do that without hypocrisy, we also need to condemn the violence against civilians that states carry out as well, right? And so, I find my position much more consistent morally and much more intellectually and morally responsible than people who take the view that we just need to think of terrorism as this kind of morally reprehensible act and stop the conversation there.
But there's no way any 90% of, well, certainly mainstream media will ever define terrorism as the actions in Iraq. So terrorism will be confined to 7/7 and the killers of Lee Rigby.
Right, absolutely. And the word terrorism is always involved. It's an inherently political term, right? It always involves a political choice of saying certain kinds of violence are unacceptable and to be morally condemned, but then kind of in the background there's other kinds of violence that are just considered rational, normal and necessary, and so we don't talk about those, even if by any objective definition of terrorism they would also count as terrorism. The kind of standard definition of terrorism is the killing of civilians for political ends, right? And so by that definition, the thousands of civilians who are killed in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia by drone strikes are also victims of terrorism.
Arun Kurdani, thank you.
Thank you very much.
It may be St. Patrick's Day, but not everyone wants to celebrate the luck of the Irish. Join us after the break as we find out that, not content with US attempts to destabilize democratically elected regimes around the world, Rupert Murdoch has set his sights on Northern Ireland. And how to get government-approved free labour in the workplace with just a few words. These stories and more coming up. Read all about it, or not. We all know the internet is killing newspapers, but is there any limit to what they'll do to get readers? Here at Going Underground, we don't think the public should be misinformed, so catch our breaking views on the past week's breaking news.
David Cameron condemns barbaric missile attack on Israel.
The Barclay Brothers Telegraph newspaper abandons any pretense of impartial coverage by only reporting pro-Israel voices in an article on the visit of the Prime Minister to Jerusalem. The journalist Matthew Holhouse felt no need to qualify or report that there may be another side to the story, quite unreflected by Cameron saying Palestinians had rebuffed an offer to freeze illegal Israeli settlement building. Come to think of it, there was no mention of Palestinian casualties caused by Israel's bombardment of Gaza.
Is a great white shark heading for Britain? Killer fish spotted just 1,000 miles off the Cornish coast, and it could arrive in 3 days.
Viscount Rothermere's Daily Mail is seriously worried about the prospect of an illegal immigrant. Lydia didn't make an appearance in the allotted time, but the article itself admitted she could be headed towards the Mediterranean or Africa.
Venezuela's anti-government protesters settle in for the long haul.
Another week, another Guardian story aimed squarely at supporting the UK and US government's foreign policy of trying to destabilize the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. No mention in this article of how the anti-government protesters who tried to overthrow the United Socialist Party of Venezuela last time turned out to be back to the hilt by the USA.
Cost of the peace process is more than some free oysters.
Rupert Murdoch's Sunday Times was never keen on the Irish peace process, so it is perhaps fitting that in the very month of St. Patrick's Day, the paper dredges up the past for an incendiary news piece. Apparently, a former IRA man now sells oysters, and we should begin a new war with Irish Republicans as soon as possible.
Controlled by Iran, the deadly militia recruiting Iraq's men to die in Syria.
The Guardian at least bothers to remember the plight of hundreds of thousands of people in Syria that have been forgotten by the media. But one has to read pretty far into this article to find out that there's actually no proof the deadly militia is controlled by Iran. But why should that stop the paper trying to scare the British public? To the relief of those with mortgages, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, indicated last week that interest rates do not need to be raised just yet. He said he was not overly concerned about the economy overheating. PricewaterhouseCoopers senior economic advisor Andrew Sentance, though, who was on the Monetary Policy Committee which sets interest rates, doesn't agree. He believes quantitative easing may have harmed any perceived economic recovery and that it's now time for rates to rise. With me is Andrew Sentance, senior economic advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers, who was on the Monetary Policy Committee here in Britain. Welcome, Andrew. Let's begin with, you're a Bank of England policymaker. QE now being credited with the reason we're recovering as an economy here in Britain. You would give credence to that?
I'm not so sure about that. I think we're recovering in the UK because the world economy is picking up. And because we have good, I think, fundamentals in large parts of our economy, a flexible labour market, and confidence is coming back.
So quantitative easing was a drain and the reason for a greater deficit, or it actually did something?
Quantitative easing was very important in 2009 when I was on the committee, and I was a big supporter of it. I think later on, during the Euro crisis, it didn't really address the problems that the UK economy had, which was high inflation was squeezing disposable incomes, and we had the Euro crisis. Quantitative easing didn't do anything for those two problems.
The media reports exaggerated when they say that you think it may have indeed slowed the recovery?
Well, I can think of ways in which the quantitative easing that was done in 2011, 2012 could have slowed the recovery, could have pushed down the value of the pound further and made imported inflation worse. The economy is now recovering, and if anything, it's picking up. And the policy we really now need is to gradually raise interest rates.
Albeit at a relatively sluggish level of growth. Your new book, Rediscovering Growth After the Crisis, goes through various myths. How do you think politicians have persuaded us all that basically sluggish growth is a problem?
Well, everything that we see on the growth front has to be measured relative to that new normal, as I describe it. And that new normal of growth, I think, for the UK is underlying growth of probably 1.5% to 2%. So when we get growth over 2%, as it has been over the last year, that's really quite good going.
So the new normal is not necessarily something we should expect for the medium term, though. I mean, politicians are very proud of it, aren't they, at the moment? The Prime Minister particularly.
I think we should expect over the medium term a gradual improvement in the UK's growth rate and in other well-adapted Western economies like the United States and parts of Northern Europe. I think, however, some economies in Europe, like France and the Southern European economies, face a bigger problem of adjustment. And some of the things that we have, like a flexible labour market and the progress we're making putting our public finances in order, are not actually working so well in those economies.
A part of the impact of QE, of the new growth statistics, arguably of QE, is of course the prospect of interest rate rises. You advocate a rise in rates sooner rather than later. Do you see this as possibly a democratic problem? Because, of course, the British government doesn't want to raise interest rates ahead of an election.
Well, we have to remember, first of all, that interest rates affect people in the economy in different ways. If you're a borrower, certainly it could mean that your mortgage or your borrowing costs go up. But there are a lot of savers out there, and I think the savers have tolerated low interest rates because they thought it was necessary to get the recovery going. Now the recovery is going, and the economy is growing better. I think we need to get a better balance between borrowers and savers.
But that swing vote, after all the Daily Mail target stories about house prices for a reason, are interested in interest rates remaining low.
Well, we have an independent Bank of England, so it's not politicians who are in charge. The Bank of England takes its own decisions on interest rates.
You believe that?
Yes, I served on the Monetary Policy Committee. I didn't see any political interference. I think the issue that the MPC has is that the prevailing mood has been conditioned by what's gone on over the last 5 years, and we're beginning to get accustomed to these very low levels of interest rates. Now, I see that as quite a dangerous thing, because it means that if we carry on in this zone of very low interest rates for a long time, it'll be an even bigger shock when interest rates start to rise. So we need to prepare the ground, and we should already have been preparing the ground through forward guidance.
That's obviously not what the Bank of England governor thinks.
That's not what the Bank of England governor thinks, but we have a 9-person Monetary Policy Committee in order to get an active debate on the right policy. If I'd been on that committee, I would have been arguing for a policy of gradual interest rates, not such that would destabilise the recovery, but so that we could gradually get the balance back between savers and borrowers.
As maybe some members are arguing, of your former colleagues, but Carney, unusually and completely unlike Mervyn King, saying, 0.5% at this point, maybe at the end of 2015. Do you think he could have been appointed Bank of England governor if it wasn't for these kinds of dovish ideas on interest rates?
Well, it's a 9-member committee, and all members have their own vote. I think one of the drawbacks of forward guidance, it perhaps stifles the scope for disagreement. And I think the forward guidance that the committee should have been geared around a sort of strategy for gradually raising interest rates rather than trying to hold them down.
Presumably he's as philosophical as you are in your new book. Why do you think he judges it differently, and presumably thinks, therefore, the housing bubble is quite a good part of this sluggish growth?
Well, I think thinking has been conditioned by the way the economy has been over the last few years. And the thing about monetary policy, it's a flexible tool which can adapt to the changes in the economy. A year ago, perhaps if you're looking at the UK economy, you might have said, well, it's difficult to conceive that interest rates will rise at any time soon. But the recovery in the economy, the way the unemployment rate has come down, has taken people by surprise, and monetary policy needs to adjust.
But are those real jobs? I know in your work you talk about the excitement of 1.7 million new jobs being created, but mostly self-employed. Are they real jobs in the economy?
I think there are real jobs in the sense that we are in a flexible labour market where we should expect more people to have part-time work and more people to be self-employed. Unemployment is lower at this stage of the recovery than any of the 2 previous recoveries from recession in the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s, it took 5 years before unemployment even started to come down in the recovery. In the 1990s, it took a couple of years, and unemployment was considerably above 7% for most of the 1990s.
But people keep talking about the geographical focus of this growth, of course, and the fact that there are large swathes of the country that are not seeing that recovery, and demographics that are not seeing that recovery.
But I think we can always sort of find some reason, if we're really determined to keep interest rates at these very low levels, But if you look at the evidence in a detached way and stand back, actually what you have is a growing economy where spare capacity is being taken up. The pound is still relatively weak against European currencies, which are a major trading partner. Inflation has only just come back to the target, and household finances have been getting into better shape. These are all circumstances in which we can begin to move away from very low interest rates that were put in place 5 years ago.
Andrew Sentance, thank you.
Thank you.
The government's made unpaid internships illegal, and the revenue has recently been cracking down on those who are hunting for free labour. So it was quite surprising then to see the government trying to get around the law that they introduced. A memo was sent to Conservative MPs advising them how to avoid paying their interns. And it turns out all you need is to get creative with your writing. MPs were advised to replace words such as work and you will be expected to do with phrases like the kind of activities it would be great to get some help with. To make it even clearer, the memo said that the term intern should be replaced with campaign volunteer. The Conservative Party responded by saying that it was simply being a responsible employer, while at the same time issuing new guidelines for young interns to ensure they're properly paid, if they're not working for the Tories, that is. Join us next time as we go underground to bring you the latest beneath the mainstream from around the UK. Don't forget, you can drop us a line on Twitter at underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, or email us on goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. See you on Wednesday.